Stephen Lungu was a famous African evangelist who died recently in 2021. His life story is absolutely remarkable. I remember meeting him in 2009 when he visited Vancouver, sharing with churches here, and hearing his story. He was raised in a broken home. As a young child, he witnessed his father repeatedly beat his mother. One day he vowed that when he was bigger and stronger, he would kill his father and take vengeance on him. Soon after that, his father abandoned them and left them for another woman. And not long after this, his mother left him and his siblings under a bridge, telling them to wait for her as she went to go and buy food, but she never returned. As a young boy living on the streets of Zimbabwe, Stephen learned to fend for himself. He grew up to be a young man full of hate, full of anger. He joined a gang called the Black Shadows, got into drugs, violence, and considered himself a terrorist. He soon became the leader of this gang, and one day, as he was leading a group of men to bomb a building with some petrol bombs, on the way, he spotted an evangelist's tent and he thought to himself, let us go disrupt this Christian meeting. He hated preachers because to him, preachers were simply white men who spoke about a white God that oppressed black people. But then, as he stepped into this tent, he was surprised that it was not a white man who was speaking, but a beautiful black young woman. She was sharing and giving her testimony about how Jesus had rescued her. He was absolutely captivated by her beauty and sat down and listened. But he thought to himself, what a waste of a beautiful young woman who is confused by these white oppressors, giving her life needlessly away. He felt sorry for this beautiful black girl and the waste of her life. Then, after she finished sharing, the white man came up and started speaking. And he said something that caught Stephen's attention. He said, Jesus knew what it meant to be homeless. Jesus knew what it meant to be abandoned, to be rejected. And he began to speak about forgiveness and about God's love for him. And he felt as though that man, the speaker, was speaking directly to him. And as the evangelist finished and invited those listening to receive Jesus into their lives, Stephen, by now full of tears, to the surprise of all his gang members, stumbled to the front of the stage and gave his life to Jesus, completely turning his life around. It was a new life and a new start, the first step of a long road of healing and discipleship for him. Stephen Lungu would become one of the most powerful African evangelists of the 20th century. This new heart, this new life is what I want to talk about today. But to get there, we need to first talk about something else first. We need to talk about the law. The title of today's message is Jesus and Torah, or Jesus and the Law. So this is what we're going to cover this morning. First, we're going to talk about Jesus and history. We're going to situate this message in our series of sermons about history and the historical Jesus. Second, we'll place God's law in God's wider scope of the Bible. We'll talk about God's law in the Old Testament. Third, we'll talk about a new community. And fourth, we'll talk about a new heart. And then finally, I want to close it off with some application. So we are continuing in this series, Knowing Jesus, the story behind the stories. And what we're doing is we're taking a step back from the text itself and looking at the story of Jesus from a historical perspective. What are those things that the majority of historians, whether they're religious or not, Christian or not, would affirm about who Jesus was in history? And therefore, what can we learn about that life and learn from the life of Jesus, from who he was as a person in history? And our topic and text today represents another very non-controversial part of Jesus' life. That is a very historically accepted part of Jesus' life. It's commonly accepted today that this very special relationship that Jesus had with the law in Judaism traces largely back to Jesus himself. It was not an invention of Jewish Christians later on or a reflection of the debates between Jews and Gentiles decades later on that would occur. But instead, this goes back to Jesus himself. It makes sense of Jesus within his historical and sociological context. How can we say that? And why can we say that with a certainty that we do? Well, there are multiple ways, but I want to name two of them this morning. The first of these is what we call the criterion of historical plausibility. Do the Gospels does the way that the Gospels portray Jesus engaging with Jewish law make sense of what we know about his historical context overall? And the answer to this is a resounding yes. For example, one of the things that the Gospels say that Jesus discussed was the importance of observing the Sabbath and what that meant. We now know that Sabbath observance was one of the debates between different schools of Judaism at that time, between the Shammaites and the Hillelites. So Jesus entering into discussion at debate, entering into discussion and debate about the Sabbath fits perfectly within his historical context. Criterion of historical plausibility. The second criterion I want to mention is what we call the criterion of embarrassment. And we've talked about this before. In the first few decades of the Christian movement, it was largely Jewish. But soon after that, it became largely non Jewish as the door to the Gentiles, the nations, opened up to the church, and all nations became part of the people of God. Gentiles soon outnumbered Jewish people in the church. So, for Jesus to have this kind of understanding of the law, where passages like the one we read today in worship about Jesus not coming to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, that not one jot or tittle will ever pass away from the law until heaven and earth pass away, that is another way of saying that the law will never pass away in some sense. This would be an embarrassing way for a Gentile believer to speak about Jesus, to understand Jesus and receive Jesus in history. It would have been much easier for the church if it had invented this passage or this understanding of Jesus and the law at a later date to say something like now that I am here, all is and the law is no longer relevant. Instead, we live by the Spirit or something to that intent. Instead, what we have is something much more complex and nuanced, that Jesus does not do away with the law. Instead, he comes to fulfill it. And this dual relationship between Jesus and the law, both fulfilling it at the same time not doing away with it, is something that would have been embarrassing to later Gentile Christians. It would have been much easier to simply minimize that part of Jesus' understanding of the law. Instead, what seems we have is that Jesus
maximizes the law. Not in the same way, though, that the Pharisees did or some of the other groups did. He reinterprets the law, but he doesn't let go of it. It's still a vital, critical part of what God is doing. This criterion of embarrassment. So these help us understand that this really was part of how Jesus understood the world and understood the law and what was important to him. And if we go through the other criteria that we have talked about, criteria of coherence and multiple attestation and dissimilarity, all of them will again point us to the fact that Jesus really had this kind of a special relationship with Torah. And the conclusion is, almost certainly, this understanding goes back to Jesus himself. Okay, so that's a historical aspect, and it's important for us to know, it's important for us to engage with, because that's how we live today. I mean, we have a certain understanding of history, or we should, right? Like sometimes people talk about fake news. Well, we can rail against fake news or fake history because we know that there is real news, there's real history. Well, Jesus was real history, and this aspect of his understanding was real history. Okay, let's talk now about what is the law in a broader sense. Okay? Now, first, I think it's helpful for us to step back from our understanding, our culture, our worldview of what law is and what it means to us. Okay, when we say law, we think lawyers, we think legal processes, we think constitutions and courtrooms and judges, or maybe we think about keeping the law or breaking law. We think maybe about law enforcement or police cruisers or policemen and sirens, that kind of thing. But that's not what law entailed for the ancient Jewish person. There were no law courts, there were no judges per se in that sense, no lawyers in the sense that we understand, no constitutions in the way that we understand, and police departments or prisons in the way that we understand today. All those things did not exist in the ancient world. Instead, for them, law, Torah, was much more associated with something that was a guideline, a way of life, wisdom, instruction for how to live so that you might flourish, so that you might experience peace and harmony, not just inner peace, but harmony as a society, as a group of people. So in the ancient world, law was actually much closer to what we might consider wisdom, wise living. In fact, that word Torah in the Hebrew comes from the word yara, which means to throw. And that word to throw eventually means to point. And that word to point means to instruct. And that's what the word Torah means, literally. Instruction, teaching. Not law in the sense that we sort of understand it, but instruction and teaching and guidance for life. It's kind of like, I think, when you go to IKEA and you buy some furniture. Now, the brilliant thing about IKEA is you can go to IKEA, you bring home a whole bed in boxes, right? Or a couch in boxes, and it's filled in these boxes 4x2 or something like that. You can stuff them in your car, and then you bring it home, and then you can start to build it. But in those little boxes are these instructions. Now, you can try to build that bed, hundreds of pieces of wood and hundreds of pieces of screws and metal and stuff, without those instructions. But if you've never built it before, it's much easier to do it with the instructions. They tell you which pieces go where and when to do what step. Now, you still probably can do it without those instructions, maybe, but it'll take you 10 times as long or 5 times as long, or you might make mistakes and you have to go back and redo it. You put a piece in the wrong place. If you follow the instructions, even though they may be kind of tedious, you will get to the destination in the end in the way it was meant to be. Torah is kind of like that. The law in the ancient world was like that. It is an instruction, a guidance about how to live. Okay, so not law in the sense that we might think of it today. So we have to kind of strip away some of our cultural understanding. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about in terms of Torah from the ancient Jewish perspective is that it's very relationally based. So again, we think about law and it's somewhat cold and sterile. But law for them, Torah for them, was very relationally, communally based. How do we know that? Especially for Israel, how do we know that? Because it's part of this covenant. And what is the covenant of Israel? Israel enters into this covenant. It's not this law that just kind of there, this pages of a book that's there, a law, but enters into this covenant with Yahweh on Mount Sinai after he rescues them from Egypt. He enters into this relationship with them after generations of him guiding this tribe, this family of Abraham, sustaining them, and then finally rescuing them from Egypt. That's the relationship. That's the context in which the Torah is finally given on Mount Sinai. Covenant, it actually means some kind of a contract, but not contract in the way that we understand. We think contract and we think paper and signing and something black and white. For them, covenant was relational. The contract was relational. There was for sure some stipulations and obligations and expectations, but it was because of this relationship that God had with his people. The closest analogy that we have today is marriage. There is a legal part to marriage, isn't there? Like you sign on these government documents, you send them away, and there's a legal status to your marriage. There are tax implications for your marriage, personal possessional status implications for being married. But is that what a marriage really entails? If that's all that marriage was, that'd be a very, very sad institution, wouldn't it? Just about the legalities. No. Marriage is first of all, foremost, about that relationship. The relational aspect between two people who love one another and are making these promises, these vows to one another. There are obligations, there are expectations, but they all serve that relationship. That's part of what Torah was. I will be your God, says Yahweh to Israel. You will be my people. I'll be the one who rescues you. I'll be the one who protects you. I'll be the one who is your God. Out of all the myriad forces and powers in this universe, I will be your God. You will be my people. You will look like me. You will do the things I ask you to do. And if you do, you will flourish. And so Torah was a great gift for them. The psalmist says, oh, how I love your law. It's my meditation day and night. Oh, how I love your law. It's a great, wonderful gift to them. It's not simply an obligation. And so eventually Torah becomes one of the great identity markers for the Jewish people. What do I mean by that? It's what distinguishes them from all the other people around them. It's an identity marker. This is how you tell you are God's people. You have Torah. You keep Torah. You keep the law. You don't look like the other people around. You keep Torah. You keep God's law. It was part of their identity. And this is a very critical point because it's not just about what they do, but it's about what it meant for them. It's a symbol about their identity. It helped identify that they belong to God. So for us, it might be something like a Canadian flag, right? It's a symbol today, isn't it? Especially in this kind of season that we're in, flags are really encouraged, and people are wearing them, and you see them popping up all over the place, even on the items at the stores that were buying, merchandise. Is it made in Canada, right? Because someone south of the border is threatening threatening our Canadian identity. And so instead, we have these symbols to symbolize our real identity. We're not American, we are Canadian. So even the fact that some people not wearing flags, like Wayne Gretzky at that Four Nations game, suddenly becomes something that is of great importance. It's part of our identity. So to a large degree, Torah observance was like that for the first century Jew. So in this passage, chapter 5 of Matthew 17 to 20 and beyond, when Jesus says, you've heard that it was said in the law, but I say to you, you've heard that Torah says, but I say to you. He's doing something quite radical. He's reorienting this cultural symbol around himself. He's not doing away with it. He says, no, it will never pass away. But he's saying something very important. He's saying, I've come to fulfill it. Right? We've talked about this. He's this new, he's reconstituting Israel now. 12 disciples, 12 tribes of Israel. Right? Old covenant, new covenant. The law, what's going on here? He doesn't do away with the law, but he says, I've come to fulfill the law. There's something incomplete about the law. It's not that he's giving a new law as much as he is completing the purpose of the law, and he reframes it around himself. And that's the key point, is that there's this new thing that he's doing around himself, and now everything centers around his identity, including what the law is. He's reshaping and reconstituting that story of Israel. Okay, I come to the last part of our teaching now, because this is where we've all been moving towards. Jesus was not just extending the law or giving a new law, but he was talking about fulfilling it. So fulfillment in lots of different senses, I think, in the New Testament. He fulfills it by pointing out the goal, the intention of it, that the heart of it is really what is important here. He fulfills it by pointing out that loving God and neighbor are really the foundation of all of the law. He fulfills it ultimately by giving the Holy Spirit, sending his Spirit to his people so that we can live in a new way. But I think the broadest, biggest sense in which he fulfills it is that he realizes that the law was inadequate to do what it wasn't really intended to do. Torah failed. The law failed. Well, better put, it wasn't Torah who failed, because the Torah was not personal. It was the people who failed. They weren't able to keep the law. They weren't able to keep Torah. And we know the Old Testament story. The end result of that story, that arc in the Old Testament is what? Exile. Babylon comes. Exile. Assyria comes and exile. And where are the people? What are the people doing when that happens? Massive idolatry, gross injustice. Those are the things that are characterizing the traits of God's people. Idolatry and injustice. They failed. So when Jesus says he's come to fulfill the law, he knows that it is incomplete. It could not do what it was meant to do. Despite the gift of Torah, despite God's presence with them, despite God's word to them, it still failed. And so he's come to complete it. Now, why did it fail? The Old Testament talks about the heart. We think about the heart and we say, oh, that's about our feelings. It's about our emotions. Jewish people wouldn't have thought like that. The heart is a seat of the human being. The mind, the feelings, yes, the will, the intellect, everything. The heart is a symbol of the human being. The problem with the law was that there was a problem with the heart. The Old Testament calls that hard-heartedness. And so at the end of the Old Testament story, the prophets talk about the people having hearts of stone. Right? Ezekiel chapter 36. The prophet Ezekiel says, I will sprinkle clean water on you. This is Yahweh talking. And you shall be clean from all your uncleanness, and from all your idols I will cleanse you, and I will give you a new heart, a new spirit I will put within you. I will remove this heart of stone from you and give you a heart of flesh. What Jesus wants to do, he wants to restart, reconstitute God's people. Not from scratch. He's taking the old ingredients, he's rearranging them in a new way that makes sense out of the old story, that follows the arc of the old story, but now is doing something new. And that something new has to do with him. That something new has him at the very center of it. Because he is the solution to that problem. Jesus is the solution to that problem. He has come to fulfill what the law could not do. He's the one who brings life and healing and freedom and power. He's the one that as we give our lives to him, as we follow him, he's the one that enables us to live in a new way. Fulfills what the law was meant to do. He gives us that new heart. The new heart is not just an eternal thing, but it's a complete holistic thing, which we turn around and we're able to live the way that God wants us to. I'll share a little bit personally my own story. In 2009, after 6 years in pastoral ministry at the age of 34, it seems like a long time ago now, I realized that there were some things in my life that were unresolved from my childhood, hidden things that I kept away from people, even from my wife, from my church, from everyone around me, things that were unhealthy, unhealthy ways of coping with life. And I knew I didn't want to live like that. It made me feel like a hypocrite. I was like Stephen Lungu in some ways, but my heart was hidden. So I felt like on the outside, what everyone else could see was fine, but what I was truly feeling was not. My tent meeting, my Christian tent meeting that Stephen Lungu, my equivalent of that, that I encountered in my life was a ministry called Living Waters. It was a ministry of healing and discipleship for those who experienced relational brokenness. I remember first stepping into that ministry that first evening. So it's a ministry that spans 20 weeks of teaching. I remember stepping into that first evening, and it was as if that speaker was speaking directly to me. And then the second week, that speaker again was speaking directly to me. And in that season of life, part of what God did was he revealed to me all the things, the tendencies, the brokenness that I have, my anger, my shame, my fear, my lusts, my insecurities. And one by one, God would reveal these to me day after day, week after week. And I saw them before me. This is who I am. This is how I've responded in my life, whether anyone else knows about it or not. He knows about it. God knows about it. This is who I was. But that's not who I was meant to be. That's not who God wanted me to be. And so in that process of journeying through Living Waters, this was nothing new. I mean, these are basic fundamental teachings of the Bible. But I came and I was able to give that and surrender that to the Lord every single week, week by week. And then what happened slowly over time is that Jesus gave me a new heart, a new way of living. That's what he wants to do for us. There was a point when I was thinking, if only I had made a certain decision in my life, then things would have been much easier for me and things would have turned out differently. But in the season of life, one day, it was like a revelation. God said to me, I felt that God said to me, no. Yeah, you could have made a different decision at that point in life. Your life might have looked externally very different, but internally, you would have still made the same mistakes, ended up in the same place, even though outwardly you look different. It was because my heart was what needed changing, who I was. What parts of our lives are merely circumstantial? And what parts of our lives are there by chance? What parts are there by grace? And then what parts are we responding to in obedience? I want to move to application now as we talk about this. I see there are two application points. Well, there are many, but two that I feel like are good for us to dwell on a little bit. The first is this concept of community. So both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the law was not given just for people to kind of keep on their own, but God was creating a people for himself. He was creating a community. When Jesus chose 12 disciples, he elected 12 people to follow him, to form this new community. Not just individually to follow a certain law, but really to dwell together, to live together in community, to enact together this new way of life. And that's what the church was in the New Testament. This people who embodied Jesus' teachings together. So how do we, as people, as Granville Chapel, continue to prioritize this sense of togetherness and fellowship? And it probably won't be just one place, but where are those places in our church, in our community, where you can be truthful, where you can be committed to one another? You can walk alongside others in honesty and in support, in encouragement, and be encouraged. You can go to God's word. Where are those places? We have to, I think, in this climate that we live in, continue to press in to community, right? Whether it's a small group or whether it's a community group or whether it's even like continuing to commit to something like going to the sponsorship house and painting a cabinet together. These things are important for us to continue to foster that sense of togetherness. So where can you? I want to encourage us to continue to press into community. Okay, second, you might not feel like Stephen Lungu, who had this life where he was, this radical transformation and then this kind of radical call and conversion. You might not feel like a murderer or a terrorist or a drug dealer or a gangster, but you probably also didn't experience the kinds of things that he did as a child, right? Abandonment by his father and his mother, having to survive on his own. Many of us grow up with lots of common graces, we call it. There's lots of privilege, lots of things that the Lord just provides for us. And so it steers us down a certain path that looks a certain way. But the question is, what if you were in those circumstances of Stephen Lungu? How would you have responded? How would you be different? So that's the question. That's the insight I had that day. Even if I had certain circumstances in my life which would have made me turn out a different kind of a person externally, what would I have chosen internally? What are those things in our lives that point us in a certain way? And how do we respond to that? And so this application point, I think, it's really difficult for us because we don't experience Stephen Lungu's life, right? We don't experience that kind of radical need. But I think one of the ways that we can continue to be aware of ourselves and that need is to press into mission. Like, given all that we are given, what have we done to respond to God's grace in our lives? How have we used the gifts that He's given us, the resources that He's given us, the opportunities that He's given us to bless the world around us? Because that is His intention for us ultimately, not just for ourselves, but for those who are in need. People like Stephen Lungu, right? As he came and became a Christian, it was a white missionary man who took him into his family, adopted him as his own, and day by day discipled him and helped him to understand that white missionaries were not evil, but in fact, that Jesus was what he needed. And Jesus healed him of these things. So what are the places that we are called to be God's voice, God's truth, God's presence to other people? And as we step into these places, I think what happens is that we become more aware, we become tested, we become challenged, and we get to exercise our heart, right? Like if we don't exercise our heart, it becomes weak. But if we exercise it, it becomes stronger and stronger. So pressing into mission, I feel, calls us into that, enables us to become stronger and stronger, and helps us to see where we need to rely on Him more and more. So those are the two things I want to leave us with: pressing into community, pressing into mission. What are the ways that the Lord is calling you? And it might not be anything new or novel. It might be something the Lord is bringing to you today, that's saying, yeah, maybe I should do this, or I should connect with this person, or get in touch with this group. It might be just a continued faithfulness because you've been discouraged recently. Maybe you just feel like, oh, why am I continuing to toil away when I could be doing other things with my time? How is the Lord encouraging you, inviting you to continue to press into His community and to press into His mission? Let me pray for us. I'll give you a moment to kind of reflect and think about in your own life. And you can think about the different circles, the spheres of your life, in your family, with your close friends, people who know you the most. How can you press into community, into relationship? And then wider into your maybe acquaintances or people at work, or maybe just people that you've lost touch with. How do you press into community and mission? How can you be God, be Jesus Christ to these other people?